Welcome to the Black Father's Pulse, the podcast where fatherhood meets purpose. I'm Dr. Alvin Thomas, clinical psychologist and professor, here to guide you through the multifaceted journey of Black fatherhood. Please note, the views expressed here are my own and not those of my employer. But get ready to dive into the dynamic world of Black fatherhood, where we celebrate the highs, tackle the lows, and share plenty of laughs along the way. Let's keep the pulse of fatherhood beating strong and vibrant. Today, we're incredibly honored to welcome the Honorable Prime Minister of Grenada, Dickon Thomas Mitchell. As Grenada's youngest ever serving Prime Minister, he's not only reshaping the nation's future, but doing so with a deep commitment to family values and youth empowerment. So we'll be talking leadership, fatherhood, national identity, and building legacies. Welcome to the Black Father's Pulse, where we amplify the voices and journeys and the wisdom of Black fathers making an impact. I'm your host, Dr. Alvin Thomas. And today I have the pleasure of being joined by Honorable Prime Minister of Grenada, Dickon Thomas Mitchell. So Prime Minister Mitchell, before we begin to discuss policy and leadership, I'd love for our listeners to hear a little bit about the man behind the title. Can you share about your upbringing in Grenada and how that has shaped your values and your vision?
Sure. Thank you for having me on the show, and congratulations on having the show on a very important topic, I think, to the Black family. I grew up in a small village called PTS Branch in St. David until I was around 13 years old. I grew up in a matriarchal home. My grandmother was a central figure, still is. She's still alive. I grew up with my mom, my aunt, a couple of uncles as well, brothers, sisters, and lots of cousins. There was a small, modest home, but always filled with lots of activities, lots of responsibilities, because we early o'clock were taught the value of hard work, of domestic chores, of farming, ensuring that you could feed yourself. When I grew up, we actually didn't have running water inside of our home. You had to go to a stand and fetch water in buckets and fill it up every morning so that you can bathe and cook and do all of the necessary chores. We didn't have electricity initially. All of those things eventually came with modernization. But there was always a deep sense of community, a sense of fun. Religion also played an important role. You had to go to church every Sunday. Sports is also important because after school or sometimes in between break, there was always physical activities, whether it was track, cricket, football, all Canadian traditional games like playing marbles or those sort of things, hopscotch. It was a very happy upbringing, very holistic, I would say. And I think it set me on the course by the time I was 11, 12 years to be independent in terms of my thinking, independent in terms of being able to take care of myself. And I think that has pretty much put me on the path that led to whatever successes I would have had later on in life.
So I'm smiling because a lot of what you're saying resonates so deeply. I still remember being given a piece of bubblicious gum. My brother and I would have spent the time doing multiple trips back and forth from the standpipe to fill the bathtubs that my mother would use to do the washing for the weekend. I still remember all of these different experiences, and of course, spending time with cousins, with distant relatives who would come to visit, and of course, with relatives who were local. I heard you talk about uncles. Who were the father figures or the mentors who really influenced your approach to leadership?
It's an interesting question because I grew up in a matriarchal home. My uncles were sort of migratory figures. They would come and go. I never really had a conscious recollection of my father until I was around 14 years old because he had migrated as well to the United Kingdom. And, one of the challenges of Caribbean society is the migration patterns. Even my mom eventually migrated when I was 11. And during the period of that until I was around 18, I lived with my aunt, and then my sister and I lived in my brother lived in my father's house. So to some extent, a lot of the male figures would seem to have been community figures. For example, Michael Dennis Lett, who was a surveyor. His wife was the principal of the primary school. And I went to his wife was a very dominant and towering figure in my life as a schoolboy. So you had people like him. He was well respected, went to church, eventually became a politician. So there are people like him who, from a outsider's perspective, I went to school with his daughters. sons, and we became good friends. We had people like that when I was a teenager going to presentation college. Mr. Lawrence Lambert, who's now deceased, the father of one of my very good friends, Lance Lambert. Just from hanging around Lance and
Right.
seeing Mr. Lambert, and even when I was in university, he would give a lot of gratuitous advice.
Right.
Also, sometimes, just even help me
Right.
financially as well. But my father, in an interesting way, because in his absence, I think I would have had a particular view of him, which probably was not favorable.
Right. Right.
But then you meet him and he would have given his version of it, and in his own way, spoken what he felt was his truth. So as a male, it also sobered you up with perspective.
Right.
Because you would have your mom's perspective, you would have
Right.
your father's perspective. And somewhere in between their life, the real perspective.
Right.
Coming to grips with that, I think, was also critical. And as time went on, I met a number of men who became very good friends to me. And in one way or the other, helped to, perhaps without them even knowing it, to mentor me or to support me. People like Mr. Hugh Dolan, who's still around today. When I started my career as a young lawyer, I worked a lot with him. The way he interacted with people, the way he viewed his business as his family, the way he always was looking for efforts to help and encourage other person. So all of those things, in a sense, rubbed off on me. But I also had cousins who I grew up with um, as uh, young men. One way, shape, or the other, all of them helped to influence my own behaviors because it gave you a sense of brotherhood and community. And today, not just cousins, we are very good friends. That also helped. I think my friends at Presentation College in particular, well, I referenced one of them, Lance, but Lambert, people like Aaron Thomas, all of the friendship, I think, helped me a lot along the way because we had a lot of fun, but I think there was also a lot of positive attributes in terms of their behavior, in terms of their loyalty, their support, helping you when you don't have money, or feeding you when you don't have something to eat, or if you probably behaving in a manner that was stupid, them being prepared to call it out and that sort of thing. So all of that, I think, helped me to become the person I am today. So there's no singular male figure that I would point to. I think it's a collection of all my experiences.
And sometime later we will talk about oil down. But it sounds like what you're saying is that all of these individuals, like the ingredients in oil down, contribute something unique to the final dish, the final person, and that each individual, in sometimes very deliberate ways, influencing and pouring into your lives, and in other not so deliberate ways, sometimes unknowingly, influencing your identity. I think about your identity as a person, but now thinking about Grenadian identity in general. And I think you've spoken about Grenadian identity being foundational to society. How was your own sense of identity formed? You've talked a lot about these individual persons, but as you were coming to terms with who is Dickon in the context of your upbringing, in the context of Grenada, how do you think that was formed?
Well, I think I had the advantage of, having essentially grown up in Grenada. When I started to travel, I think my first conscious, recollection of differences in culture would have been when I traveled to Canada to visit my mom as a young teenager. I must have been 14 at the time, and you sort of get a taste of how vast Canada is, and almost by nature a bit impersonal. And you also recognize that there are actually very distinct features of human behavior when aggregated together that creates a culture.
Right.
So there's a distinct Canadian culture. And then it immediately dawns on you there's also a distinct Grenadian culture. What was a bit curious for me was, in a sense, I think when I met Grenadians in Canada, I think almost subconsciously, unconsciously, they would try to recreate in many respects the Grenadian culture in Canada. And sometimes culture that no longer was in Grenada, because it's like holding on to that sense of who you are, because you quickly recognize that you're in a different space, a different culture. So I think from then, as I traveled more, I recognized that there is something unique about how you brought up in Grenada. What are the values we stand for? How we interact, how we speak, how we sing, how we dance, how we phrase things. And in a sense, that gives you your own unique. So it's important for us to appreciate that when you aggregate people who live on an island or live in a country together and you've created a way of life, that is really your civilization, your culture. It distinguishes you from any other group of people. And as small as it is, it has the capacity to be impactful and to be potent, both in terms of just giving you a sense of who we are, but also in terms of influencing the rest of the world as well. I think that is also important because, you know, maybe it might be impolite to say so, but sometimes you go to places where someone will say there is no culture there,
Yeah.
implying that as human beings, we probably sank to the baser side of us rather than trying to elevate or improve.
Right.
So in that sense, I think who we are, the struggles of our people, where we come from, what has created the lifestyle and the value system we have is important. And if we don't preserve that, and you preserve it by obviously constantly, you have to sift and refine because
Right.
some parts of our culture are not pretty either. And you have to be able to work on and improve those. But I think it's important for us to understand that. And then second, from the perspective of nationhood, because as small as the island is, we're an independent nation.
Right.
And I always say to people, there are less than 200 independent nations in the world. And therefore that means something. Actually, that means a huge, big deal in a world population of billions. So in addition to that sense of identity, you actually do have nationhood, which millions and millions of people are still struggling to get and to accomplish. So I think that is also important, and it's something we should not take for granted.
I really appreciate the ease and facility with which you're able to tap into what is Grenadian culture, but also appreciating the stark differences in some cases subtle differences and dynamic differences with regard to other cultures juxtaposed against Grenadian culture. But as you think about Grenadian culture and its uniqueness in global culture, what is one lesson from your childhood in Grenada that you believe every child in the world should learn?
I think for me, if we can have children grow up without references to them inculcating in themselves or in others a sense that your value is to be measured by the material things you have, that would probably be a singular lesson for me. So I would probably say I'm not so sure I fully grasped the concept of material poverty until I was an adult. In hindsight and by any kind of comparative basis, if I just described to you that I grew up in a home with no running water
Right.
and no electricity, and a lot of us in the house, in a 2-bedroom wooden house, you would probably instinctively think that's a poor
Right.
household. But I never felt that way growing up. I still don't feel that way
Right.
when I look at it in hindsight, because hygiene was always stressed and was a critical thing. When I say to people, I never even went to a dentist until I was a full-fledged adult, and I think my overall health is pretty good. So the idea that poverty automatically leads to things like poor health or poor outcomes in terms of your education or your healthcare or your sense of purpose or who you are is not something that I readily accept. And so at the same time, there were children who absolutely were better off by almost any matrix on a material level. But in my interaction with them in school, after school, during break, on weekends, whether in church or socializing, I never felt that they thought they were better than me or behaved that way. I certainly never thought that they were better than me or behaved that way because of their material circumstance. And in many instances, I think the classism that oftentimes we create because of material things or what people possess at any given time in their journey in life, oftentimes influence how people treat or behave you. And I would certainly say for me, throughout certainly my primary, secondary school, and I would largely say even up to national college, it was never an issue. I certainly was never conscious of it. I hope not just me, but that others who grew up with me at the same time felt the same way. I've never really asked. But for me, I think that was something that I always cherished. I never felt that teachers made you feel you were less because you might have been coming from a materially poor home. That they made those coming from a materially better home feel like they were better. We all viewed as children. I think the teachers and the neighborhood and the community all embraced us as that. And so that eliminated any sense of lack of confidence or it didn't create any self-doubt or anything like that. So for me, if we can have children grow up in that setting, I think it certainly would help to make the world truly egalitarian, where people are more judged based on their value, their behavior, their character. And it will actually encourage the right types of characters to grow rather than just where you pursue selfish material things only.
I think that's a very lofty goal. And yet it was a goal that we seem to have achieved a long time ago. Your grandmother's generation, my grandmother's generation. It seems as if it's a goal, an ideal that we have lost along the way. in the pursuit of development and betterment and enlightenment?
Well, I think a lot of what we call development is just
Mm.
rampant consumerism.
Exactly.
Excessive materialism. I can't think of any other term too.
Yeah.
It's almost devouring ourselves. So it's a lot of excess. Yeah, right? It's not necessarily development, and development has to be sustainable. So there are lots of things we can argue about as to how you value
Right.
development or growth. So I don't necessarily want to get into it. Greed is something avarice, gluttony is something we need to be careful about. Not because you could consume it, you should consume.
Mm.
Not because you could buy more stuff, you should buy more.
Right.
Right? Because I think especially for smaller, fragile society like ours, I'm talking economically and in the ecosystem, there has to be a point where sufficient is enough.
Right.
Right. And that you can't be constantly just trying to get more and more material things,
How-
especially when you don't need it, because it will lead to lack of sustainability, whether it's environmental wise, ecologically wise, whether it's a tool on your health, whether it creates greater income disparities and inequalities, which then leads to social chaos and so on. So you have to be careful about that kind of value system. Mankind has been around for a very long time. And I think some of the lessons of ancient civilizations is that when you become excessively materialistic, then the underlying values that leads to social cohesion breaks down, because
Right.
you have greater income inequalities, greater material inequalities, and then it becomes them against us, and then the whole thing implodes. So we have to be careful, I think, in the Caribbean about the pursuit of excessive materialism or excessive consumerism, because as I said, it's not something that's sustainable, and we have to be careful about recognizing that sometimes it's okay for me to give up some more so that someone who has less can get a little more, rather than just continue with
Getting
me
for
having more.
myself. Right.
When especially you having more will not actually improve your life.
Right.
And then that there are persons that they got a little will make a significant difference.
How do you change that mindset? How do you translate that on a national level? I mean, it sounds like a really great ideal for a personal family kind of setting, but how do you translate that to national level?
Well, I think you have to lead by example, since I'm
Mm.
obviously in a position to do so, and I have, because I could have just continued thinking about my own personal material circumstances
Right.
by saying, I want more money. I want to stay in a profession that pays me better than doing public service.
Right.
So walking away from my law firm at arguably the height of my career and going into public service and accepting a salary that's probably the lowest I've ever worked for, maybe 3 years out of my 20-year career, having to literally make your life an open book because, public property, so to
Right.
speak. Putting my family, especially my kids, through the inconvenience of what it is to be a public servant and a politician. All of that is basically saying I am actually prepared to put skin in the game rather than just
Right.
talking, by saying I could have continued chasing bigger cases,
Right.
larger legal fees, more vacation, bigger cars,
Right.
a bigger house, etc. But what happens to the fact that every day I see there's a file in front of me and more and more people are begging for donations
Yeah.
or begging for this or asking for this because they can't afford healthcare.
Right.
And therefore, since the more isn't necessarily going to make the quality of my life that much better,
Right.
I'm prepared to give up the more and take the personal sacrifice so I can do some public service and try and see that I can make a difference. I hope I can. So you can start there. So leadership matters.
Right.
And then second, I think education matters and the value system matters, because you see, if you don't encourage things like sharing or caring about each other or looking out for your neighbor, fraternity, solidarity, principle, then we're animals. Let's remember that first and foremost. And if we don't constantly work on our own value system, then we descend quite rapidly.
Yeah.
So we have to understand the basic things. If a human being doesn't brush his teeth in 24 hours, you will not be able to stand next to them.
Right.
Right. So the fact is, we can't take our civilization for granted or civility for granted. And so similarly, the values we have can be changed. If you have disruptors, if you have people who are persistent, who are deliberate, they can change your value system. If you had a closed society and now you're one that's opening up and you're opening up to different cultures, different values, they can change your behavior. Sometimes people say things can't change, but I think we all have been around long enough to know that the only thing that actually does happen is change. And so it's, whether it's good change, bad change, indifferent change, change will happen. And so I think in terms of making sure that we have a more sharing society, we have to work on that all the time. You can't think, okay, for 10 years we work, we caring, we sharing. Don't continue investing in that. 10 years after it disappears, right? So it is something we have to be mindful of. So it requires consistent involvement of each generation if we want to constantly build the country. If we don't do that, then you have what you call lost decades or lost generations because you didn't inculcate at an early enough age the values that you want to maintain in the society.
So you've taken on obviously one of the most demanding roles, that of public service at the highest level. Many of our listeners are also taking on a really demanding role of their own, fatherhood. Do you see parallels between fathering and leading a country?
Well, sure. I didn't think I wanted children, and I have two. I probably never thought I'd be a politician.
Right.
And I'm a politician, so I think that alone says you have to be able to adjust. You may plan your life, but there are lots of things we don't have control over, and when those happen, you have to be able to adjust. Second, I think for me as a father, I learned. Well, it's interesting because obviously you don't carry the children. Therefore, for the relationship to exist, you have to actually build a relationship. Yeah, I think it's the one singular difference between a father and a mother.
Right.
You know, there's almost a natural, inevitable connection between a mother and the child. Even if the mother gives away the child 5 seconds after, you know, the mother carried the child. So the impact that has on the mother physiologically, emotionally, psychologically is clear. With a father, there's really no physical interaction. And so for you to actually be a father and have a relationship with a child, you have to seek out your son or your daughter. You have to want to engage, you have to engage, and you have to build a relationship. That's the only way in which it will happen. And similarly, I think to get involved in politics, you have to seek out, even if people come to you and ask you to get involved, you have to make that conscious decision and then you have to work at it, both in terms of building the relationship with your constituents, and with the population at large, and then working and trying to nurture that relationship and then talking about the decisions, the values, the hard work, what you need to do, what you don't need to do. And then obviously you have to listen as well because your children are individuals. Although as parents, sometimes you think they're not appendages, they are sentient beings who have the capacity to think, to act completely independently of you, completely differently. And no matter how much you pour into them, at the end of the day, they have the absolute right to say, this is the kind of relationship I want to, this is the kind of relationship I don't want. And in leadership, it's the same thing. You know, you serve, you may think you're giving everything you have to the country emotionally, physically, materially, and at the end, the country could say, thank you, we prefer someone else. So I think as a parent, you have to be mindful of the fact that the children have their own lives to live. And you can love them, you can support them. That's really your job. But at the end of the day, as they become adults, they have to live their own life.
So you made this very brief, seemingly obvious and simple, but very poignant statement that change begins right here. I think at the time you were speaking about youth empowerment. How does that philosophy of change begins right here apply both to raising children and governing a nation?
You know, I think one of the things we struggle with in Grenada and I think the Caribbean, and there may be many factors accounting for it. I talked about migration patterns. I think we really do struggle with the role of men and they're being responsible, first and foremost as parents, as fathers, and as responsible citizens. You know, and it is something we have to address. You can't keep blaming women and say it's the women who are raising the boys or, you know, the men are migrating. Each of us as men have to take responsibility for action. And we need more of us to individually and collectively man up and take responsibility and look in the mirror and ask ourselves, who are we? You know, what are our roles? What are the relationships we're having, particularly with our children and the mothers of our children, even if the relationship has ended romantically. And I think if we don't address this issue, you're not continue having a lot of challenges that our young men face. So it is something that I think, you know, for those of us who think we're doing an okay job with our own kids, we have to help other men.
Yeah.
Right? Because if we don't, your kids are going to find themselves in the minority or outnumbered or dealing with the consequences of majority of boys or friends who themselves have had no fathers, no father figures, no one to even talk to, no one to even understand the challenges that men go through. So I think one of the things that we really do need to work on is addressing the significant challenges that men face in the region, from the violence they perpetrate against each other. First, there's a lot of talk about gender-based violence, rightly so. There's a lot of that. But the biggest victims of male violence are males.
Yeah.
Right? Of the almost 400 plus inmates at the prison, the inmates are men. So both the victims and the perpetrators are largely men. We had a spate of shootings in 2024. They're all men, killing men. Right? For no reason. So, just valuing life and humanity is something we teach men to appreciate. We have the highest rates of suicide are amongst men. Right? And, on a comparative basis, women are outperforming men at every ladder on the education spectrum. Every ladder, in everything, including technical and vocational education. Health outcomes. Women live longer than men. There are higher rates of gambling addictions, alcohol abuse amongst men. So they are very few. I mean, we're all trending for the wrong reasons. So I think from a fatherhood perspective, it is not just your children, but you have to be a father to other boys who may not have a father if you're in a position to do so, whether it's to talk to them, to encourage them, to support them, and then obviously to be a brother to the fathers who are struggling with understanding parenting, fatherhood, how to handle difficult relationships, and so on. So this is a major, I actually think it's a pandemic in the region. It is something that we have to not just talk about, but I think create the infrastructure and the incentives for people to start addressing those things. If we don't, I can't see us having a positive future in the Caribbean. So that's one of the key things I think from a fatherhood perspective. There's significant deficit there that I think collectively as a society we have to be able to work on.
So if you had to distill your message specifically to fathers who feel overwhelmed by today's challenges, the culture, and all that wonderful stuff, if you had to distill that into one statement to encourage fathers, what would that sound like?
I think the statement would be to put your energy into your children. Right? There's a gratification, I think, that comes from being able to talk to your children, just to be able to talk to them. That no TV, no money, I'm not even sure your wife or your girlfriend can give you. Right? Because especially if your child is a boy and is a teenage boy. Right? Because one of the challenges I think Black men particularly I think have struggled with is the ability to actually have a civil conversation with each other. That is not aggressive, that is not trying to be a pissing contest, that is not trying to have one man gamesmanship, that isn't competitive. Right? I think we've unfortunately been fed and have accepted that we need to always be competing with each other. We need to always show I'm the bigger, better man, rather than just basically recognizing that we're brothers trotting the path to overcoming some of the challenges. So I think if we put our effort and energy into our kids, just talking to them, listening to them, checking in on them, offering to help with the homework even if they don't want the help, offering to come see them play some game or walk. Just ask. They may tell you no, but internally they would appreciate the fact that you've offered them. Suggesting that they bring their friends over to play or to whatever. Those little things mean a lot. I think as you continue the journey, you quickly appreciate that even if you haven't learned the art of talking, if you just sit with them in silence and say nothing, they'd appreciate it because they'd recognize that you're making the effort. And you have to be consistent, not show up when it's graduation from high school and disappear for 2 years.
And that's the hard part.
I think those are things we have to be able to talk about. Right? How to navigate the difficulty. Okay, yes, your mother, you may not be getting along, but the focus is not on her. It's on the child. So I think that consistent behavior is part of what we have to learn to inculcate in men. And I think over time, you'd see some of the improvements. I do think there are lots of things that men have improved on. That's just based on my observation growing up. I think they're a lot more affectionate publicly. Their kids, you definitely see men being prepared to do things that perhaps in the past people considered traditional, whether it's to cook, wash, drop their kids to school, pick them up, those kinds of things. We need to encourage a lot more of those things. But I think first and foremost, we need to encourage men to speak to their children. And I don't mean discipline them. I mean speak with them, just conversate with them. How was your day? Did anything funny happen in school? Who's a funny teacher? Who's not a funny teacher? What was challenging about whatever exercise, the group works great. Just normal conversations. And you'd find that your kids probably are quite funny. You'd find that they can teach you a lot of things about technology, about changes in the world, about concepts that you never heard of, with social media and so on. It's new. So I think if we can encourage a lot more of that, it will make a significant difference.
No, I agree with you. I think you're spot on. I think the challenge, like I was saying, is the consistency. It's sometimes very easy to start it,
Yeah.
but to continue to make the time
Yeah.
to engage in that investment. It sounds like that is what you're doing for your own self. How do you balance that immense responsibility of your current position with being present for
Well, I'm not
family
sure I'm doing a good
moments?
job, so let me be honest.
Because they will be watching this and listening.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I'm doing a good job. So that's the first thing I need to say. I think my own kids gave me a bit of a, you know, rude awakening. I think once when I was, I was driving them home, and I think they made the comment that I think my son got a PlayStation, which I wasn't in support of because there was a friend who bought it for him. He was trying to, I guess I had to go and create the account so that he could log on, and he had this nickname of someone called Busy Man. So I asked who was Busy Man, and he's like, "That's your nickname." Right? So that was a nice way of saying to me that I'm always busy.
Yeah.
And the obvious inference is I'm busy, so busy that I don't have time for my kids. I think I kind of objection to it, but it left me sobering and reflecting and thinking, okay, there's probably some merit to what is happening here. We did have a little debate about it, about other things like why did I have to be a lawyer and why not be a teacher? But there are other things that they sobered up about, like the fact that maybe as a teacher they couldn't afford the vacation they were getting, and those kinds of things. So we balanced out the argument. But I think it left me in my quiet time reflecting a little as to whether I was actually spending enough time or doing enough. In my mind, I think I am. And oftentimes, you want to be the breadwinner, you work long hours, you want to provide, which is instinctive. But also, you have to realize there has to be a balance. And at the end of the day, if you don't spend time with them, even if you give them a lot of money, it's not going to cure the hole that they have inside of them. So I've had older friends who've gone through that. And in a sense, they say you're a fool if you don't learn from the experience of others and want to actually experience the bad things yourself. So I think that is, over time allowed me to recognize that you must be there and be deliberate, no matter how busy you are, in terms of actually just doing normal things with your kids until they get to the point where they don't want you to do it and they say you're suffocating them or you're hovering too much, which is fine. Then at least, they know you're there. So, I try to make the effort. I mean, as I said, it's not something that you get perfect at. You have to constantly try and deal with it. But I think it's important. And so you have to find a way to create the balance, particularly for the kids, because they will get older and move on. And you, in a sense, get back your life if you put it that way. But until such time, you have to find a way to prioritize it. In my busy schedule, I think my staff try to help by setting aside days, making sure that I don't take appointments on days when my daughter is in the house. It doesn't always work out, but at least they are also understanding of what comes with my job. But thus far, I think I've managed well. I'm happy the job has not overly complicated my children's lives. They still live pretty normal lifestyles, just like any average kid in Grenada. I'm very happy for that. I mean, for me, I distinguish between me and the office. The office is the office of the Prime Minister. I'm Dickon Mitchell, right? And as much as possible, I try and live as Dickon Mitchell. I mean, there's some things that the office of the Prime Minister, I guess, necessitates and you come to the job. But in terms of just who I am, I just try and be the same person that I've been.
So let's talk a little bit about your vision for Grenada's future and how it connects to families. You're advocating for Grenada to become a republic during your administration. How would you explain that significance or the significance of that transition to a child, and what does it mean for their future?
Well, I think a system of governance is largely inherited. And although we obtained independence from the United Kingdom, the entire setup of the state in terms of the judiciary, parliament, the executive branch of government, the office of the Governor General, which is the head of state and representative of the crown in the United Kingdom, all relics and legacies of our history. But we always have to reflect on the institutions we have and ask whether they're fit for purpose. And so for me, the conversation about republicanism against monarchism, if you want to put it that way, is a bit superficial. What we really need to ask is whether the system and the government structures we have and the institutions are fit for the purpose of Grenada. And my view is no. I certainly don't think you need an expensive ceremonial head of state for the office of the Governor General represents. We simply just can't afford it. We're struggling to in schools and even the parliament and the judiciary. Why would you spend on a ceremonial head of state? So to me, the system of government should really be about in a small place, ensuring that you have effective governance and representation,
Right.
one that's cost effective as well, because there's a cost to government, right? Tax costs be a lot to maintain all of this.
Right.
So the government should be service oriented, efficient, and cost effective. So if you have institutions that are largely ceremonial in a country that isn't wealthy,
Right.
and you have to maintain those ceremonial institutions, then my question will be why?
Right.
Right. So I think that's one. If you have a government that is heavily centralized and heavily bureaucratic and not able to effectively and quickly and efficiently respond to the needs of the citizens, then again, the government becomes ineffective. And if it becomes ineffective, become frustrated. And when they become frustrated, creates tension
Right.
and upheaval and so on. So from that perspective, therefore, I think when we talk about republicanism, I'm really talking about having one head of state. I'm talking about having a head of state that's elected by the people. I'm talking about a system of government that is hopefully more responsive and more effective. And there are different models that you can look at. You can look at the American model. You can look at what many of the countries in the region have done, which is to replace one ceremonial head of state with another ceremonial head of state.
Yeah.
I've said I'm not going to support that. You might as well just leave the governor general if that's what you do. So, but I understand why countries have done it. It's symbolic. It's just a break with the monarchy. You no longer have a monarch, someone who's not elected by the people, but someone who simply just by the accident of birth becomes your ruler or your head of state, as opposed to someone who's actively going out to say, I'm here to represent the people and give me an opportunity to do so. So I think that's critical. I think in the context of parenting and so on, at the end of the day, when you have a child, that child inherits from you certain things. They inherit your genes. If you grow up the child, they are likely to inherit a lot of the value systems that you impart into the child. You are likely going to feed, nourish them, give them an opportunity for education, etc. But ultimately, that child too has to become a child that's fit for purpose and a child that has to live their own lives, their time. Be often products of our time. So my kids probably don't know what a BlackBerry is, don't know what a pager is, typewriter, because those things just simply they become obsolete. So for me to say to my daughter, don't use the phone, use the typewriter, would almost be the equivalent in my view of saying, well, you need to keep the governor general because you inherited it. As opposed to saying, is this fit for purpose? Right? Is the system of government fit for purpose? So I think to that extent, we have to recognize that technology changes, time changes, and people also have to be able to adapt and survive. And as they say, if you can't adapt, you're unlikely to survive.
As chairman of CARICOM, you addressed critical issues affecting the Caribbean region, including crime prevention through a public health approach. What role do you see fathers playing in creating these safer environments across the Caribbean?
But I think fathers will probably, if I had to pick a group of people, probably could have the single largest impact to be fathers. And I would probably say to be men. I already referenced the fact that perpetrators and the victims of crime, particularly violent crime and criminal related crime, from homicides to, violent assaults, largely men. And we obviously need to ensure that fathers can play a significant role in helping to socialize their sons in a manner that gives them wholesome values and steers them away from the glorification of criminality that has pervaded a lot of our communities. And I suspect that the statistics will bear me out. In many instances, the young men who join gangs do so because they don't have a father in their life. Right? Because they don't have that relationship. So you're looking for brotherhood, for role models elsewhere. And obviously, where poverty abounds and where you have broken family relationships, it's easy for young men from as early as 11, 12, 13 to be enticed by the gangs, to be enticed, especially gangs who are actively recruiting. And so that's one of the if we had to look at one way of stymieing that, ensuring that we teach men to be parents and make sure that they're parent would be one critical way of addressing this. So not only that, if a father is a criminal, it's likely the son is going to be right. You see that because that's what the son is going to see. So they're likely to emulate that. And that's, they're proven, in places like Jamaica, they're proven legendary father-son criminal gangs.
Exactly.
Mexico and these places, you see that because if you grew up in a crime family, that's what you know. It's normal. We've had here situations in Grenada where there's a young man whose last name is Cyrus from Grenada who was killed. His father was also killed. A couple of years before by gun violence as well. So you pattern is there, and they tend to repeat themselves. I think intervention at the father level, teaching parenting, teaching responsibility, making sure the fathers are in their sons' lives, is one critical tool that we must use in order to address the public health challenge that crime and criminality poses.
Agreed. Totally agree with you. So we're coming to the tail end of the interview. And at this point, we call this the lightning round. So you don't need to elaborate. Just think a little bit about the response and pop up. I have about 4 questions for you. And again, no need to elaborate on them, just whatever your response. The first question is, what is your favorite way to spend the time with family when you can step away from the PM duties?
Probably cooking.
Cooking. Okay. And what is one Grenadian tradition you believe every family should adopt?
Cooking again. The family should learn to cook together.
Yeah. Okay. Oil down, doubles, or jerk chicken?
Hello.
Okay. I figured that would be the response. So I'm going to ask it differently. Rank order these.
Right.
Oil down, doubles, or jerk chicken?
Oil on jerk chicken double.
Oil down first,
Yes.
chicken then doubles.
Yeah.
Okay. Complete this sentence. The most important thing a father can give his child is...
I'm tempted to say love, but I actually think discipline.
I almost want to break my own rule and say elaborate, but thank you very much. So thank you very much, PM Mitchell, for sharing your wisdom, your vision with the Black Fathers Pulse community. Please subscribe for more conversations like this, where we celebrate and empower fathers while giving voice to their stories. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, sir. Pleasure.
The pleasure.
You've been listening to the Black Fathers Pulse. I'm your host, Dr. Alvin Thomas. I'm a clinical psychologist, researcher, and director of the TriLab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Views shared on this podcast are mine or that of my guest and are not associated with the university. Original music for our series was composed and performed by Micaiah De Silva, artwork by Isabella Acra. The podcast is produced by me and is supported by the kind contributions of you, the public, and advertisers. Follow me on Twitter at Dr_AT758, that's Dr_AT758, or the Black Fathers Pulse podcast on Instagram and YouTube. Subscribe to the Black Fathers Pulse podcast wherever you do your podcast listening, and don't forget to share and leave us a positive review.